everybody, and welcome back to Distilling Greatness, the podcast where we explore the stories behind those who've achieved remarkable success and are making significant impact in their communities and industries. I'm Jeff Arnett, Master Distiller of Company Distilling, and your host today. And today we're also joined by a remarkable influencer in the whiskey and cigar community, Mr. Chris Chapanar. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get into it.
Absolutely. As the founder of Whiskey Noobs and a well-known whiskey and cigar enthusiast, Chris has built a dedicated following by sharing his passion and expertise through his engaging content and insightful pairings. He's become a trusted voice in the spirits industry, helping many discover the joys of whiskey and cigar pairings. Today, Chris is going to share a little bit about his journey, the art of pairing whiskey and cigars, and his thoughts on Company Distilling's flagship product. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. Let's get this thing going.
Excited to get into it.
All right. So it's great to have you today. You've built quite a following with the Whiskey Noobs and the Perfect Pairing podcast. Can you share a little bit about your journey and how you got started in the world of whiskey and cigars?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got started in the world of cigars before whiskey, actually. And I started off back when I got started in cigars. You could get into them when you were 18. And so I got into cigars. And then eventually I got into pairings, and I'm like, hey, I like this whiskey stuff. And then that led me into the world of whiskey to the point where I basically left cigars on the table until recently with the Perfect Pairing podcast and everything. So cigars really got me into whiskey. I stuck with whiskey for a while, and that just led to me wanting to study up on it as much as I could and learn as much as I could about it. As I'm sure most know, it's a slippery slope. You get into it and you're like, oh, this is fantastic. I want to know everything now. And that's basically how it went for me too.
So when it came to the cigars, was there like a particular brand or, what piqued your interest in tobacco in particular?
I think what really started it for me was my dad was into cigars while I was growing up. So I always saw them. He wasn't heavy into it, but I always saw them and I was like, well, it must be enjoyable, right? Like if he's smoking them, it must be enjoyable. And then actually a buddy lent me, I think it was out of a pack of Gurkhas, if I remember, one of those like value packs. You can get like six of them. And he handed me one and I really enjoyed it. And so then from there, I remember I went online. I forget where I went, and I ordered like a bundle of cigars so that I could try all of them. And then that was the first slippery slope, I would say.
I think I did that. There was a time in my life I really got into cigars as well. And I think I started when I was on a trip somewhere. I flipped around in the back of the airline magazine, and it was, I think, Famous Smoke Shop. And they had like a starter pack of different cigars to try. And I got stuck on these ones that were called Placentia Reserve Organica. I don't know if you've ever had those before. Really mild smoke. Very easy cigar, very enjoyable. Didn't have a lot of aftertaste the next day. A lot of the things that I saw as the negatives of smoking a cigar, I didn't have those. So I really started there. But then the next thing I know, I'm into Cohibas and Patels and Arturo Fuentes and all. And CAO Cigar was in Nashville. I was just south of there, so I got to know some of the people in the cigar industry, and people would start, filling up my humidor. Which was fun to be able to share those with people as well. But. So,
yeah, and I mean that's a big part of it. Sharing it with people it makes it so enriching.
Yeah, my cigar story kind of ended abruptly because my daughter went to a health fair when she was at school, and they showed this big cancerous tumor on her lip, and she fainted. and she came home from school and said, "Dad, please don't smoke cigars anymore." So I told her, I promised her I wouldn't, and I gave away all the cigars out of my humidor. So that kind of ended it. So I had some friends who really were grateful for that incident in my life because I just dumped thousands of dollars worth of cigars on them. But it was fun.
I bet.
So tell me, what do you think sets aside the content that you do in the social media space? And, why do you feel like that has been so embraced, the Whiskey Noobs thing, so broadly?
I think what really set me aside in the beginning, there was something I did on purpose and something that I think kind of happened on accident. So on purpose, I wanted to be newer. That's the name Whiskey Noobs. Mm-hmm. When I started it, I was like, I'm not a full noob anymore. I'd already done a lot of research, but I wanted to cater to people who were new and be less intimidating. So I thought, well, I'm not like a guru yet, and whiskey's super intimidating, so maybe I'll be less intimidating for people. And then I think what accidentally happened was because I was newer and because I was trying to be so candid, the authenticity really came across, and people felt they didn't they didn't have their guard up when my content came around. I wasn't afraid to really be wrong. I'd respond to comments back when TikTok was blowing up, and I'd respond to everybody's comments. If they were like, hey, you got this wrong, I'd be like, oh yeah, maybe I did, and I think that candidness really set me aside in a world where a lot of people they don't want to show if they don't know something. And I try to stick to that today.
Yeah, I think when I took over as Master Distiller at Jack Daniel's, one of the principal roles I played, I traveled, was a face and voice of the brand. But I like you, I felt like I didn't want to make it mysterious. When I would do tastings of Jack Daniel's, I didn't want to be very pretentious about it. And I felt like I had done tastings where I would be in the same room with other brands, with their ambassadors or distillers. And some of them would get really, really over the top, with some of their flavor descriptors. And, Woodford was one of the brands in the Brown-Forman portfolio. I was from Jack Daniel's, but, Woodford would claim 200 different discernible flavors in the whiskey. So to me, that felt like a little bit intimidating to people. And, it certainly hooked a certain type of consumer. But I really wanted Jack Daniel's to be more welcoming than that, less intimidating than that. So every time I would do a tasting, it wouldn't be, a lot of flowery language or stuff. It would be, here's how your palate is designed. Sweets on the tip of the tongue, sours on the sides, bitters on the back of your tongue and throat. Everything has a mouthfeel. It can be like water. It could be like milk. It's the umami. It's the savory. These different elements of mouthfeel. So as I would go through the portfolio, I would say, think about not just what you taste, but where you're tasting it. Is it on the tip of the tongue? Does it feel centered on the palate? Does it feel like it's largely in the back of the throat? These are things that are basically telling you whether it's sweet or bitter. And it's sort of like milk chocolate to dark chocolate. All good. It's all chocolate, but it's showing up in different spots of the zone. So you don't have to overanalyze it, but the reason you like certain things may often come down to that, whether you like sweet or not. And having a range that can kind of explore that and give people what they want.
Absolutely. And so often that's all that people need. I've talked about this before where it's like, you don't need to pull, lightly toasted almond coated in sugar. Now, sometimes will we say that in reviews? Absolutely, because we're trying to get the point across. But if from the hobbyist side, you can say, oh, this one tastes good, this one tastes bad, this one's sweet, this one's bitter. And that's enough for many folks. And so I love that, because I think it's important to have that approachability for sure.
I would always say this one's good and this one's gooder and that one's gooder than good, because it's all good,
Right. Absolutely.
But yeah, definitely. I always felt like a well-designed portfolio gives people a range. You can work grains, you can work wood. There's a lot of different things, natural forms of flavor that you can work from. But part of the exploration we're on here at Company Distilling is trying to do that. Having come from a brand where we did honey and a fire and an apple product and stuff using flavorings, I was like, those were successful products, and it certainly broadened the appeal of the Jack Daniel's brand into new markets. But at the same time, it wasn't the thing that kind of inspired me the most. I'm like, I want to work from natural forms of flavor and do these little nuanced things that I feel like people will appreciate, once they understand. It's like once you get it in the mouth, it's like, why do I like this one? When maybe I don't like that one as much. It's like, well, here's the anatomy of them. It could be the wood, it could be the grain, it could be a lot of different things. But, I've got one that I think it's largely sweet. So I've got the milk chocolate option. And then I've got something that's doesn't have any corn in it. The toasted cherry wood finish on it. I'm like, it's the one that's sort of like in the dark chocolate range. And then I got something in the middle that kind of hopefully checks a lot of boxes for a lot of people. That's the mass appeal product. But anyway, so what are some of your favorite things about being a whiskey influencer and connecting with your audience?
I think the answer is right there in the question, connecting with the audience. It's so great. I think exchanging stories with people, and especially recently, as I've been able to go to more like events that whiskey lovers are at, connecting with them in person and getting to talk to them, and really learning everybody's story of how they come to whiskey. That part has absolutely been a blast. And then also just the response that people have given me, because a lot of times it can feel one-sided. It can feel like I'm just speaking into a camera every day. And when people really get back to me, give me feedback, tell me I like this, I didn't like that, or even I've had some, real strong, like back when I was making the podcast more regularly, the podcast, it's been something great for me to sit down and really think about, and it's helped lower that barrier that we talked about. So that because that's what I set out to do, that really was my favorite part, was getting that type of feedback, which I still try to do in all my videos. And then beyond that, now that I've started connecting with people, that's now become a really front seat thing that I've really enjoyed, building a Discord community and seeing people in person and being able to actually talk to them.
Right. Actually, that became one of the sort of mantras of our brand. I was leaving Jack Daniel's during the pandemic in the fall of 2020. It was when bars and restaurants, there was a lot of unknowns about how that was going to go, the trajectory of the pandemic, and if some of our social norms were going to be changed forever, because whether people were gathering at restaurants or in bars where everybody had their choice, where there's 100 items, in the back bar, everybody order what they want. We chose the name company because, if there is a silver lining from the pandemic, I hope it's that we don't take for granted the ability to get together and learn from one another, spending time together. And that's where the name company came from. We wanted you to have company come over. We want to have something worth sharing with them, that you could explore together, make memories around. So that kind of became the inspiration behind our brand and the name, because people laugh all the time. I'm like, we actually considered 36 different names to name our company. and everybody's like, well, what were the other 35? That had to be an awful list if you went with company. But I was like, no, when the name company came up, it was literally the one that everybody had the strongest response to, and it was positive and negative. It honestly was. So, Some people immediately thought of, having company come over. Other people thought of the reputation of companies and them not always being good, the big bad company and an enemy of the people and the worker and stuff. So I think once we work through that, the word company means those you break bread with. It's more like companion. So then, we think of it now as a place you show up to draw a check. But
right.
But that's not originally what it was. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, and I love that too, because that's like such a huge part of the hobby.
Yep.
Even asking me what I like as an influencer, my response is still the company,
Yeah.
like that's such a big part of it.
Yeah. So, and we have a big whiskey festival that happens here in Townsend. I'm in Townsend today. So right outside the national park entrance at the Smoky Mountains, but we have a group called the Bourbon Whiskey Thieves. I don't know if you've met any of them. Anthony Riccardi does a podcast that's called WTF, and that's Whiskey, Tobacco, and Friends. So he also does this, the bourbon and cigar pairings, and is pretty well expert level based on what I've seen from him. He definitely knows what he's talking about. But they love gathering here. They've kind of gotten to know a lot of the Tennessee distillers. It's a weekend that they get to hang out with them. They smoke cigars. They can drink drinks. Everybody brings their dusties and the bottles that they found over the last year that they're proud to share. And it's a very fun weekend here. And if you're ever in the area, just let us know. We'll make sure that you have tickets to get in. First Saturday in November. So just let me know if you'd like to come to that. So,
I'll have to take you up on that.
Yeah. So when it comes to what considerations do you have when you think about pairing whiskeys and cigars? What are the criteria that you're considering as you think through what's going to work with what?
So that is a loaded question, and a question that I love, because it is so difficult. And one of the things I've especially learned since diving into the Perfect Pairing podcast is that so much of it is not intuitive. There are some kind of rules of thumb you can kind of grab along the way, but even things as simple that I used to think intuitively, like a strong cigar is not going to go with a weak whiskey. I used to think that, and then I've had Bushmills Irish whiskey with GTO La Cura, which is a super dark wrapper, and it worked. Yeah. So what I like to say is, first and foremost, if you can try some things, that is super helpful. But the second thing to think about is what's going to play with each other. A lot of times finishes are going to play really well with cigars. The finish will really come through, or the finish will really be stripped away. But either way, you get a nice perspective on the whiskey. So you want to think about that. And then in general, you want to think about which one you want to focus more on. Do you want a more dominant cigar with a lighter whiskey so you can focus on the cigar? Do you want a more dominant whiskey with a lighter cigar so you can focus on the whiskey? That sort of a balance is really what I tell most people to aim for to get started, and then try some things on their own and really try to figure out which types they like, which types of pairings.
Yeah. So when it comes to cigars, are there ones that you think are so superb, the cigar is so superb, that you really don't want the whiskey stepping on it? Is there one that comes to mind that you're like, I never want anything strong coming up against it because I want the pleasure to come from the tobacco?
I think honestly, the answer is anything that you've bought for a special occasion that you're like, this is
Hmm.
I can't wait to try this cigar. You got to be careful what you're going to pair it with. Try the cigar first,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then do the pairing, because you might have even a weak whiskey that totally changes the cigar in a way that you don't like.
Yeah, I've often told people when people have asked me, "Hey, what advice do you give people when it comes to approaching whiskey, maybe a new bottle that they've never had before?" And it would always be, "Don't ever read the label and assume you know what you're going to want to do with it. Every bottle deserves at least one neat sip out of it, so that
Hmm.
you understand the basis that you're starting from. And that if once you've had that one neat sip, if you decide you want to put a little water on it, or you'd like to put a cube on it, or there's a specific cocktail that you can kind of imagine building, on that liquid, then that's great. But I don't think you're ever going to read a label and get that type of knowledge. A sip is literally worth 1,000 words of description when it comes to whiskeys, because you do your best to tell people what to expect. Everybody describes and seems to the flavors, they'll read them a little bit differently.
Hmm.
Everybody has the same sweet zone, but some people are going to call it vanilla, some are going to call it caramel, some are going to say, "Oh, no, that's butterscotch," but and none of you are wrong. It's basically what you're relating it to and what you're typically is in your diet. But one neat sip is excellent to inform you to make a really good decision after. So just
Yes.
I always say, even if it's a high, even if it's a cast strength, just give it. There's a reason why it's being presented at the proof that it is. Take just
Hmm.
one neat sip. You might be surprised that you can actually drink it neat at cast strength. So
Yeah.
yeah, but don't just assume anything.
Right, I'm
Yep.
with you there. That's why I base so much around blind tastings, is for that exact reason.
Yeah.
People get so caught up on proof or age or one or the other, and it's like, try it first and
Yeah.
then make your
Yeah.
judgment.
Oh, for sure. So if somebody's a beginner and they're a noob, so they're going to
Mhm.
be starting into whiskey cigars, what advice are you going to give them? How should they get started?
Honestly, my favorite advice is to try things and don't worry about trying the most expensive things yet, but try things. And if you can get in the budget range, especially with whiskey, I always say three $30 bottles is going to do way more work for you than one $90 bottle, because you're going
Yep.
to learn so much more. And then I think something that works great with both cigars and whiskey is trying things side by side. Trying a rye whiskey and a bourbon next to each other. You're going to learn so much by doing that. And I did that with cigars, and that's what really made me start to understand cigars. But by far, it's trying things and not worrying about that top shelf or top shelf cigar stuff until you start to know what you like. And then you can start to dive into that more expensive stuff.
One of the things when I left Jack Daniel's, I was leaving a portfolio of like 11 products at the time. So, I felt very confident that there was something among those 11, if somebody was willing to drink,
Yeah.
that was going to be good for them. Starting company, one of the big challenges I had was, if I was only going to have one bottle, what should it be? And, what's going to provide me the most mass appeal? But really kind of being handicapped at the same time. When I first became Master Distiller of Jack Daniel's, their portfolio was 3 products. So I was able to grow it out to
Mhm.
11. But even those first 3 were pretty well, spreading different. There was Gentleman Jack, the double mellowed version. It was really sweet, tip of tongue, didn't have a lot of finish on it. There was the more balanced expression of Old Number 7 Tennessee whiskey, and then you had the richer, fuller, higher proof of the single barrel. All the same grain bill, but definitely checking different boxes. But
Yeah.
the most powerful thing you could do is exactly what you just said. It's all comparative. It's relative. So
Mhm.
tasting one in isolation is really difficult to kind of understand where it is in the range. So now that we've got our portfolio built out to at least 3 products, I feel like now everything makes a little bit more sense when people go through the tasting. And I'm finding that typically people will like 1 or 2 of them and not the third one. And I would say, if you like all 3, you're actually an outlier. That
Mhm.
you would truly, if you're being honest with yourself, there's going to be 1 or 2 of these that are going to be more appealing to you, because I'm spreading the grain bill, the range, the wood, pretty big from one product to
Yeah.
the other. So you're never going to hurt my feelings if you say that's not my favorite, but because it may not be yours, but it will be the next person's, and that's what you're kind of finding. I have people like, I don't like rye, but the rye wins every time we put it in any type of a competition. It wins usually one of the highest awards, if not the top award for it. So we kind of feel like, hey, it's okay if you don't like rye, but if you do like rye, this is a really good rye. It's
Right.
one of those things.
Yeah.
And I do think ryes are pretty good with cigars. It seems because
Yes.
they do tend to be able to a little bit bolder. I always describe them as being heavyweights.
Hmm.
That you can put out a soft rye, but I'm not sure why you would. A soft rye would be a bourbon or a Tennessee whiskey, because that when you're
Right.
taking that rye content down and replacing it with corn, you're kind of moving away from the spice and pepper and all the things that define a rye. But, you might as well be big in proof, big in rye content. If you're going to do a rye, go ahead and own it, step up,
Yeah.
and be a puncher in the heavyweight category because that's what ryes need to be. So,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
so when you first tasted the flagship bourbon, what cigars came to mind for you as a potential pairing for this? I know we sent you a bottle, gave you a chance to kind of taste through it.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that. So my answer as I've done so far is going to be to try multiple because I
Yeah,
love to.
yeah.
But I think what comes first to mind, I'm hoping it would work out the way that I'm thinking about it, would be a Connecticut that has a nutty sort of a bread and woody flavor because I'm getting a nutty presence in that flagship bourbon. And then there's also a bit of that oak, but it's kind of like a light oak. It's not super, super dark and charred. So I'd love to try like a strong, like a real heavy-bodied Connecticut, which is almost an oxymoron, but maybe like a Camacho Connecticut or something like that. And then I would, of course, throw the exact opposite at it to see what happens. So
Okay.
maybe that GTO La Cura that I mentioned before, because I always like to just throw the opposite end of the spectrum and see how it holds up to it,
Yep. So I'm not sure how much information you have about. So I assume that you got the Maplewood finish bourbon of ours, the blue bottle, correct? That's
I have straight bourbon whiskey, actually, and
finished with Maplewood.
it does not. Oh, yes, it does. I missed the finish with Maplewood. Yes, I do. That's okay.
All right.
All
All right.
right.
That's the one I would have expected you to have gotten. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. So,
Yeah.
leaving Jack Daniels, I had not worked with weeded bourbon at that point. So, actually, Jack Daniels will have one coming at some point. There was something laid down, not a lot of it, but just trying to create some opportunities for innovation. We had about a 5-year pipeline planned out as I was leaving Jack Daniels, so we were at least 2 new products a year. We're pretty much baked into the warehouse and the barrels that we had there. But when I was leaving Jack Daniels, I was like, I'm kind of intrigued because the weeded bourbons, I felt like it kind of carved out a nice little quality halo around their brands. It was, Larceny had won recent awards out of Heaven Hill. You have, of course, Weller and Pappy out of the Sazerac or Buffalo Trace lineup. You had Maker's Mark and Maker's 46. And the thing that I always thought was good about the weeded bourbons in particular was that they tended to be approachable. They when you take the rye out, you're kind of taking away one of those things that can be a polarizing feature of flavor for some people. Some people like a little bit of rye, but there comes a point, there's a threshold that once you exceed it, they're like, I don't like anything greater than some percentage. So I felt like it was just safest to stay away from it if I could. So that's kind of what inspired. We went with weeded bourbon. There's actually 3 different ones in that bottle that we worked together in a recipe. And then what I liked about it is it was such a good candidate. I'd worked with maple before at Jack Daniels. The 27 Gold product was maple barreled. Found out very quickly that maple barrels provide great flavor, but they don't hold liquid well. They just bleed out. In 5 months, you lose as much as 5 years in oak. So once you had spent time in 2 barrels, you built 2 barrels, you only have half the product you started with. It gets very expensive very quickly. But that was sort of like the reimagined process of 27 Gold on a weeded bourbon to try to create what we called approachable complexity. We don't want to disappoint somebody who's got a fairly sophisticated palate, who's been drinking and is looking for something interesting, but we don't want to overwhelm the noob either. If somebody's a whiskey newbie and they're like, hey, I'm ready to step up, I want something that's got a little bit more character, I don't feel like that 90 proof flagship product will run them off. So if there's only one bottle you're going to put in your cabinet or just a handful you can afford, if you can't afford 50 or 60, the next time you're having company come over, we wanted to be one of those bottles that you could pour to a new person and a fairly mature person where you both are looking at one another nodding going, this is nice. This is that's that meeting in the middle point. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I actually feel so validated by that. I'm really glad I misread it because I wish I would have said this before you told me it was finished in Maplewood. So Jack Daniel's Gold was the whiskey I had on my wedding day. And it was reminding me of that. And I was like, it has that taste like that a little bit. And that's that maple finish. I didn't even see it on there. I think
is.
I'm gonna need some LASIK here soon. But yeah,
Well,
I'm glad to hear that though. Wow.
well, and when I first started pitching this, a lot of people, when I told them it was Maplewood finished, they would taste it and they were assuming it was going to be almost like a Crown maple, which is actually like maple syrup
Oh,
sweetness. And I'm like, no, 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 no. This is
right.
maple wood. I'm not using anything artificial in it. This is water, grains, yeast, oak, and maple. So it's all natural.
Yeah.
I'm keeping it straight. I'm not going to be adding in and going into, things that are not natural to the process, if you will.
Right.
But of course, I guess
Right.
in the world of bourbon, even maple is not considered a part of the process. You have to kind of own up to that. It's like, well, it was a bourbon, and then I put maple on it. So,
Right.
so now we're in a different, realm. But at least you can descriptively let people know. I'm just kind of I always say, try to find something that maybe has a final chapter to be written, and to make it interesting, using the wood as sort of that last little bend in the story that makes it
Yeah.
interesting. And I've learned quite a bit that not every liquid and wood finish are going to get along. When you vary corn, rye, and stuff like that, there's certain woods that begin to shine. There's synergies that exist between them, complements of flavor, but there's collisions and where they don't get along at all either. And you just need to be honest about that, and not force fit it. But that was one of the first things I did when I left Jack Daniel's. I started laying down I went and got a bunch of liquids, because for the first time in my life, I was not going to be working exclusively with Jack Daniel's liquid. I was going to be, I had, the world was my oyster at that point, whatever I could find that I could finish. But I just started doing a wood matrix on it to try to figure out. I knew these high corn, low rye grain bills. I knew weeded grain bills. I knew kind of what was out in the market at that point. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to put a unique signature on something that reflects where we're going until we can hit our new make, which we should be able to do in the next year or so. So I'm very excited about making that transition. So I always say, if you like what we're doing now, you're going to love what's coming. It's just this is just the tip of the iceberg of where we're going, especially in that weeded bourbon space. So.
Now, what did that look like, trying all those different finishes and having to track them? I mean, was it a huge undertaking, or what? I mean, how did that go? I'm really curious.
There were some logical ones that I wanted to consider. There's kind of some stair steps that you can take. You can go really low in rye, or you can go sort of mid-level, super high, or go full into rye. You can do a 51 or a 95, but then there's a 21, there's a 36. If you're looking at like products from MGP, you can kind of establish different rye contents.
Yes.
And then if I drop 5 woods on 4 different liquids, I've got a matrix of 20 products that I'm now going to be assessing across and say, okay, if I'm going to put these in rank order, how do I see them? How does a flavor, which ones are sweet, which ones are spicy? How would I, kind of line them up, and which ones seem to have strong synergies together? And just kind of see what floats up.
Nice.
I mean, long before we had selected anything that was sort of in the low rye, high corn space, I already knew Applewood was going to be a complementary wood for it. And I knew the higher the rye content cherry, the higher the rye, the more cherry stood out. It's the right wood. It's the one that kind of meets it where it is and kind of complements it. So the maple, I'd already knew enough about it from my time at Jack Daniel's and studying it, that it's a fairly universal. It can kind of bridge a pretty big span. Most woods cannot. Maple probably is the strongest to be able to kind of nullify, in a way, the underlying grain bill, and it will get it'll find its way in the liquid, as long as you don't overdo it. You can always say, when you're finishing, it's almost like brewing tea at a time. You can overdo it.
Right.
Yeah. It's just like the same way you can overbrew tea, because of that, especially if you're going to punch it up on the back end. Something that's already fairly mature, already got a lot of flavor. One of the reasons why I don't work with 10 and 15-year-old liquids to start is I would describe them as they're already finished. That sort of that final chapter is already written on that, and there's really nothing else that needs to be added. But if you can find something that's in just kind of entering that maturity window, where it's still, it's got a good character, it's got good balance, but it still has some room to accept something interesting and unique that would create a signature for it. Those are the liquids I'm looking for. Ones that are fairly well along in their maturation path, but not completely finished yet. So that I can kind of steer it or bend it for that final step.
Yeah, I think that's a good philosophy, because if you're I've had some bottles where you see that they don't cooperate, they just clash, and you got two strong presences both trying to make themselves known, and it doesn't work out great.
Yeah. So I would say that building a brand and an audience is certainly challenges. What are some of the biggest obstacles that you face in building the Whiskey Noobs and Perfect Pairing?
I think the biggest thing for me, especially getting started, was my age. I started off at, I think, 22, and I looked 22, and nobody
Mhm.
wants to listen to a 22-year-old talk about whiskey.
Yeah.
So that was a
And
huge
you're 25
obstacle.
now? What, I mean, how old are you now?
Yeah, no, I'm 25, about to be 26.
Okay.
So I
That was a
still
guess. That
people.
was a good guess. I didn't know.
It was a very good guess. Yeah, yeah, and so still I get people with that.
Yeah.
So and I've always tried to communicate. You can't put it in every single video, but I try to communicate, I know I'm young. That's the idea behind this. I'm
Mhm.
trying not to be intimidating. But that was a very big obstacle. And then I think also realizing I have to learn not just about whiskey now, but I also have to learn about content creation and be my own editor and my own content creator and my own videographer. That was a very big stepping stone as well. Yeah.
So I have been wearing you out with questions for the last, I don't know, 40 minutes or so. Are there questions that you had of me? I know we had a little bit of a chance to have a conversation before we started today, but I was letting you know that if there's anything that kind of came out of today's conversation, things about my background, if you wanted to know, feel free to ask. There's nothing off limits. So let's, anything about having been the master distiller of Jack Daniels that you find interesting. It was a pretty interesting role. I'd be the first to tell you, it wasn't one I expected to get. But it
Yeah.
certainly paved a path for me that I'm grateful to have the opportunity to build my own brand and distillery now, and to get the freedom of choices that come along with being an owner. That I was not, I had a lot of decision space at Jack Daniels, clearly, to go from 3
Mhm.
products to 11. But there was always that. It wasn't my decision alone. We had a brand team, we had financial people, and you had to go sell. Even great ideas sometimes would fall short of the criteria that the company was setting for it. But anyway,
Well,
any
yeah.
questions for me?
I am curious about that aspect
Yeah.
of it, actually, going from a big place like Jack Daniels and then to owning your own business. How did you have to like change your mentality? I imagine that's a pretty big culture shock to go from something like that to running your own show. Um, there's totally different, I would say, priorities, I'm gonna guess.
Yeah.
So like how did your mentality change? And were there like roadblocks that you didn't think about because you were coming from a big place like that?
Yeah. So anything that I would consider doing at Jack Daniels had to have some large scalability components built into it. Jack Daniels was sold in 170 markets, different countries around the world. Ideally, the products that you were going to launch were going to be accepted into markets outside the U.S. The U.S. is your largest market, but Jack Daniels does about maybe 5 million cases of the Old Number 7 brand in the U.S., but it's closer to a 15 million case brand when you add up all the countries and all the brands and and honey and all these other different things. So.
Mhm.
And once you get to a size, that large, and you have obligations to shareholders, of course, and if healthy growth in your industry is seen to be 5 or 6%, you're literally starting every year looking for another million cases of volume, and that is a massive hurdle to try to
Yeah.
clear. It's like, is that going to come as a combination of 3 or 4 ideas? That's going to exhaust a lot of resources and planning, even for a company like Brown-Forman. They would really love to find that 1 million case idea.
Mhm.
You can organically grow brands or you can innovate, but innovation has become a much larger part. I think we can all agree there's never been more choice on the whiskey shelf than there is right now.
Yeah.
Brands, even well-known brands like Jack Daniels that are well-respected, need to innovate and have new offerings just to stay relevant and in the conversation. That's why the portfolio went from 3 to 11. It
Mhm.
wasn't because I just had this itch to change up the portfolio. It was that you need to do that if you're going to be talked about, if you're going to be relevant.
Right.
What's nice about being away from Jack Daniels is I don't have to worry about whether or not something is scalable to 1 million cases. That's not success for me. I would say, at Jack Daniels, our first goal as a company was to make something worth sharing. I didn't say make
Mhm.
something that's 1 million cases. I just said make something worth sharing. So if it's a good idea and it's something that doesn't, if we can sell it for more than it costs us to make it, then there's a profit in it and we can sustain a business on that. But first and foremost,
Mhm.
let's do something that we're proud to put the company name on, that we're proud to tell people about, to promote. It's not just me. There were a handful of us that came from the industry. We had different experiences. Collectively, there were about 4 or 5 of us who had about 70 years of experience. So that goes
Mhm.
into pretty much everything we're doing here. I try to take the lead there with some of the ideas that I've got, but I really rely upon people that I know from the industry and trust who are part of this company to say, you tell me what, I did like 5 product models recently for a couple of releases I'm going to do in the fall. I let an internal pool of people at the company tell me what the 2 strongest options were. It wasn't just, I voted, and I was just one person in the vote, but I got like 17, 18 people involved to vote it out. And whatever floats to the top is what I'm going to do. So it's kind of cool to be able to do that. So and have the freedom to do that. That's not the way the process looked at Jack Daniel's, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, but yeah, it's just what can you what options do you have on the table? Work up models, share them to everybody, and say, I'm not going to tell you what's in the glass. I'm going to give you numbered samples, and you rank them in order. And so it's like a golf. It's like whatever's your first choice, it gets a 1. Whatever's your last choice, in this case, it was a 5. And it's like it's a golf match. Low score wins.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But
so when you're having people taste them, then is there like a specific goal in mind for what you want to bring to market that's different? I mean, you mentioned there's like so many options on the shelves right now. Is there like something that you were trying to do with company that makes it different, makes it stand out? And do you tell people that when they're tasting the samples?
Clearly the one thing that I was working on when I was at Jack Daniel's, I spent a couple of years studying wood finishes, and part of that was for the Tennessee or the Lynchburg Distillery series. So if you came to Lynchburg, it was a small 375 bottle, looked like it was lab labeled. You couldn't find them in the normal store shelves, but it was just sort of a distillery exclusive type bottle. But started exploring wood finishes in that. Also started looking at how to replace the maple barrel on the 27 Gold to turn it into a wood finishing process to get the loss, to get the cost of goods down on it, and to retain the character. I actually had a plan that I could have taken that 80 proof product up to a 90 or 100 using a maple wood finish and save the 20 to 25% angel share that was associated with that barrel. So bring the cost, raise the proof, but bring the cost down so it would be a more affordable bottle, still a premium product, but maybe slightly above single barrel versus twice single barrel's price on the shelf. So it was a great liquid, and I hated to see it go away. So I'd spent a couple of years trying to figure out how to make it more sustainable, more viable as a product. And when they told me they were going to kill the product anyway, that was when I was thinking, I don't think I want to just stop, kind of doing this. The wood finishing is much more fun than doing a honey or a fire or an apple product for me. It's just, it inspires me a little bit more to work with natural means of flavoring. And I enjoyed doing it. And I was doing 50 barrel runs there. Here I can do a single barrel run if I want to. So 50 was a minimum run there, even just to support the stuff that was in the visitor center. But still, so anything I can think of that I can get my hands on, I can produce. If I can get a label produced for it and get it approved by the TTB, get a cola for it, it's on the table. So there's really not much boundaries there, which is nice.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So then, so let me ask you this. So you said it went from 3 to 11 while you were there?
Yep.
Okay. So out of the 8 that you had added on to the brand, did you have a favorite? Was there a favorite child?
Yeah. I was pretty proud of the 27 Gold. That was a collaboration between the distillery and R&D to make the maple barrel. And the maple barrels looked like oak barrels. They just didn't hold liquid very well. But there was no doubt. There was no doubt that the flavor that came out of them was just pure magic. I thought it was the best product that we made. It always did well in tastings. I would watch people, people kind of stare at a $100 bottle, not sure if they wanted to buy it when they would first come to the distillery. They would take the tour, they would taste it on the tour, and they would walk back into the bottle shop, and it would be the first bottle they grabbed. They'd go snatch it up, and then they would kind of shop around and think about anything else they might want. But it was clearly the favorite. So I always thought that one was great. But, one of the first products that I did, it wasn't necessarily anything different, but we did a thing called the Heritage Barrel for Jack Daniel's, and we had not been in the awards for a while. Jack Daniel's posture related to awards had been kind of one to avoid them. I think maybe submitting bottles to awards and not getting awards would potentially kind of be a black eye on your reputation. So, they were talking about awards that, the last award that they had won was like an 81 of the ones that were listed on the side of the bottle. They had not been participating in it. But on the Heritage Barrel, I think everybody felt pretty strongly about it. We should go ahead and send them off to some of the awards. But it got the number 3 whiskey the year that we released it. And we had not been on on a list like that in a long time. And it was
Yeah.
very simple. I didn't change a thing about Jack Daniel's necessarily. It was the same original grain bill, the one that had won all the original awards. But I did go back and address some of the things that had changed over time. And one of them is in a modern cooperage, you can char a barrel very quickly. And you know, in the days of old, they would have to get out there with some type of a hand burner, you know, to kind of char the
Right.
barrel. So that's a much slower approach. So you're going to toast the wood quite a bit before you ever get to the point of charring. So you're going to have that time where you're heating it up. And toasting and charring are different. It's like whether the marshmallow is above the fire and slowly turned and browned, or whether the marshmallow is dropped into the fire and pulled out and blown out. You know,
Right.
the slow patient approach at the top is toasting. The one that drops it into the fire and blows it out is charring. And those create different flavors in the wood, and they do on a marshmallow as well. But I went to a super high toast. I lowered the char, which would be more indicative of a barrel maybe produced 100 years ago. And I dropped the entry proof because entry proofs had slowly risen over time. It's an economic thing. You know, Jack Daniel's is able to make a great product with a 125 entry proof. It's just a little bit better product if it's 100 on the entry proof and bottled at 100. You know, so
Yeah.
you know, economically that would probably bankrupt the company if they tried to do that with every barrel. But for a set of 1,000 barrels, I decided let's go back and honor some of these, you know, old traditions that the way the distillery ran years ago, and see what comes of it. And you know, I had the CEO Brown Foreman come to me and say, you know, that may be the best Jack Daniel's I ever had. What is different about it, and what would it take to do that with every bottle of Jack Daniel's? And I said, you don't even want to know. You know, it's like, you know,
Right.
first of all, those 90 warehouses you have in Lynchburg would need to be about 125 warehouses, because
Yeah.
just to hold the same amount of liquid, because of the utility loss on the barrel. So all those things were kind of playing in. But
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh
But-
man.
so
I actually do have one more. I'm sorry. I feel
Hey,
like
yeah.
I'm grilling you now, but
No.
as you're talking, I'm like, I
Yeah.
gotta know. So I'm curious. You know, I've had people on my podcast, but I'm on your podcast. What
Yeah.
made you want to come out with a podcast? Where did that idea come from? I'm just thinking about it as we're sitting here talking.
You know, I think one of the things is we want people to get to know us. You know, we want people to be curious about what we're doing. This is one way to get our name out there. We're still a pretty
Yeah.
small brand. We're distributed into 6 states. We hope to double that this year. So hopefully it gets easier and easier to find bottles of our product over time. But this is a way for people that may be out of state to be able to tie in and hear what we're doing. You know, one of the things I like about company is I feel like we've got a great story to tell. And I think whiskeys in particular are sold on stories. You know, I think a lot of times if it's a vodka or a gin, it doesn't really matter where it came from or who made it. Whiskeys are a little bit different animal. People want to know the grain bill, who made it, where is it made, can I visit the distillery? These are not questions that you typically ask about other forms of distilled spirits. It's a whiskey thing, right?
Right.
So I think this is a way for us to share stories and engage people and hopefully make them curious enough that if they're passing through anywhere near one of our distillers, we've got one south of Nashville, we've got one here right outside the Smoky Mountains. If you're in the area, please come see us. We'd love you to stop by and do a tasting and have a cocktail. That's, you know, we're trying to have attractive facilities with, you know, great customer service that gets people, you know, interested in our brand a little bit further. But, you know, just trying to win fans one at a time. And this is just one more mechanism to get ourselves in front of somebody and get our story out. And like I said, we're a new company, but there's about 70 years of experience, a lot of stories behind how we ended up getting here, and we just want to be able to share that. So
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes that makes a lot of sense, honestly.
So I'm getting the big red flashing sign in front of me that says time to wrap it up, because we try not to run this too
Okay.
long, because we want to be respectful of people's time and keep it interesting. And you've been a great guest.
Absolutely.
I do appreciate it. But there's always one question we like to ask everybody we have on. One of our brand's mantras, you know, company distilling is gathering around with good company. That we want to be the spirit that you think about sharing, being appropriate for people who matter to you. So the final question is this: what is your favorite way to gather around with friends and family, and what does a perfect Whiskey Noobs gathering look like?
That is a real easy answer from me. For me, it is on a Sunday night going over to my parents' house when it's hot outside, because I'm in Ohio. It's not always hot outside. Sitting out on the deck, and my dad and my good buddy who always comes over, and I will always try new bottles. And that is the way to try a new bottle right there.
Yep.
It's
Good
great.
deal. Good deal. Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for being on today. Appreciate it. And hey, for everybody who's out there, is there any way that people can follow you? Information? What's the easiest way to follow you if they're not following you right now? Let me. What are your
Yeah.
handles? Yeah.
TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are all at whiskey_noobs. That's whiskey with the E before the Y, like the US spelling. Whiskey_noobs. You can find me on there.
Awesome, Chris. So if you're not following Chris, please pick him up and listen to him. Chris, thank you so much for being on. And for everybody who's been listening to this episode, we appreciate you joining us for Distilling Greatness. Tune in next month. We'll have more interesting content. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me on.